I am very excited today to be joined by Andrea and Gabby, who are from Sargent Mennonite Church in Winnipeg. And we've had connections over the years, and I'm really excited for this opportunity to talk about some of the issues that are facing not only our church, but also our world context. But before we get started, I want to ask the question about our heritages, because we all come from what might be typically non-European, Russian, or Swiss Mennonite backgrounds. So I am half German, half Filipino. My parents are immigrants to Canada. And how about yourselves? Would you share with us a bit about your heritage?
I am from Mexico originally, and my family is first generation immigrant to Canada. I actually lived in the States for, was it like 6.5 years or 7 years, not continuously. But my family's heritage is indigenous Mexican and Spanish.
Yeah, my dad is black from the United States. He's from Chicago and he immigrated to Canada. And my mom is part Syrian, and we're not actually sure the other part of her ancestry because she was adopted by Mennonites, which is how I ended up here.
Cool. Now, when people think of the Mennonite Church, and I know this for some folks in Winnipeg, because we see a lot of Mennonite churches and we have this association with white European Mennonites who have come here, different parts of the 18th, 19th century. What does it mean in your mind? I know, like, I've had to work through this. What does it mean to be a Mennonite and separating, that heritage piece out from the faith and confession piece?
Well, I think it's really important that we recognize that, like, the majority of people who are Mennonite actually live in Ethiopia. So that's like kind of a shocker to a lot of people. And I think it's just important to recognize that, like, um, your blood can't be the only reason that you have faith, right? And like heritage is vastly important, but um, there's a TED talk called The Danger of a Single Story, and it talks about how if you tell one narrative about one type of person for long enough, that becomes the norm, and everybody else who is part of that kind of gets pushed to the margins. And so it's really important that we tell different stories of different types of Mennonites so that that doesn't happen to us.
I actually grew up Quaker, and in my home meeting, uh, I'm fifth generation Quaker. So I grew up with the understanding that even though faith has been passed in our family, and there's a long history and connection to Quakerism, that it started in England and with this guy named George Fox, and but then it spread, and then you don't have to be white British to be Quaker, right? And so adapting myself to into the Mennonite world, that has always been in the back of my mind. It's like, well, but I'm compelled by this faith, by Anabaptism. And I grew up with the understanding that even though a faith tradition and story is very important, you don't necessarily need to come from there in order to hold it as your own. So I think it was me growing up in this particular background that made it really easy to identify as a minority Mennonite.
And like you said, a minority Mennonite in Canada, but not globally, right? Yeah, I think I've always thought that the early Anabaptists would have been shocked if people nowadays have this image that I can be a Mennonite just because of my bloodline, um, but that it is a confession of faith that anybody can live into. Now, as you said, Andrea, being a minority Mennonite in our context, what has that experience been like, or for both of you, right? being people of color in the Mennonite Church specifically, um, how has that experience been like for you and your faith journey?
Well, for me, I grew up on a farm near Langham, Saskatchewan, which is a very small town, rural. Um, and I always grew up in the Mennonite Church because my Oma adopted my mom. So everybody kind of like had this understanding that I was like Mennonite, right? Like adopted in, so like Mennonite. Um, so now often I get comments like, because race isn't really a thing that we talk about in our context unless it pertains to Indigenous people. But since I'm not Indigenous, that never really kind of was the focus. So now I get a lot of comments from people that are like, oh, like, you've always just been Mennonite to me, you know? And like, or like, oh, I didn't even realize like you were a person of color until, you know, I realized it. Or like, yeah, things like that, which are interesting, right? Like people always say like, oh, I don't see you as a person of color, or things like that. And those are kind of the comments that I usually typically get in the Mennonite Church. And it's interesting because people don't realize kind of the full meaning of those words to somebody who is a person of color. And that like, it kind of implies that like being Mennonite means you can't be a person of color or something like that. Yeah.
What I wanted to say before is, yeah, we get a lot of comments that relate to or make reference to our skin color or lack of. Like, for example, I've been told, but you, like, you feel different, like you feel like, you know, you look different. Oh, you could easily pass as a Russian Mennonite. And that surprised me that like someone would think of saying that, because it is not my goal to pass as, you know, a white person. I carry my own story, my own heritage, my own family story, and I feel like when people try to make a commonality between the two of us, but like faith doesn't have anything, you choosing this doesn't have anything to do with your background. You are just Mennonite, or you could very easily pass as one of us. And that passing comment, it's like, so I couldn't be who I am if I didn't, like, you wouldn't like accept me if I didn't just pass, right? So it and we get those comments. Actually, there was a period of time earlier this year where I kept getting those comments, and I just kept thinking to myself, what is going on around that people feel the need to assert this? The other thing that I've often experienced is that we talk about, as a church, as an institution, as Mennonite Church Canada or a particular congregation, we talk about minority groups or people of color or diverse churches sort of as the other. So when we're talking about Mennonites that are not Russian Mennonite or Swiss German Mennonite, it's like, oh, those minority congregations, yeah, like we want to be like sister churches with them, and it kind of ignores or discounts the fact that there are people of color within other congregations that are primarily white, and that those stories are not often told, or people don't necessarily reach out to those individuals as much as they reach out to or they talk about minority congregations.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that like with all of this new like conversation that I've been having with lots of Mennonites, they always ask like, I'm like, oh, we're starting this like minority Mennonite thing. People are like, oh, are there that many minorities like in the church in Winnipeg? And it's like, oh yeah, like there actually really are. And just kind of like some assumptions that get made. Like, I think an experience specifically for Andrea and I is people always think that we're sisters or the same person. So people will come up to me and start speaking Spanish to me, and I'm like, I don't know, hola, like, I don't know any Spanish. Or like, yeah, some things like that. Like people always confuse us for each other or like assume that we're sisters. Like just the assumptions that get made just because there's only the two of us, like beige-ish people in our church.
This is kind of going a little further than the questions, but I'm just curious because we're talking about the Mennonite Church in particular. Why, like, do you have your own assessment? Because Sargent looks somewhat similar to my church, Sterling. Um, why is it that so many of our churches are not as diverse as churches in other denominations?
Yeah, I think it does stem from this conception that like there is a single story that's been told for so long that like if you're Mennonite, you have like the last name Clausen and you're white and you have blue eyes and blonde hair and you grew up in like New Berktal and you eat vareniki and like farmer sausage and there's a whole story that's like told and that's kind of what you feel like you have to be in order to fit in because if you don't look like that or you don't do those things it can be very isolating in the Mennonite church because a lot of time like stories that are told are stories relating to those very inside group topics so it can be very isolating if you don't know or aren't familiar with those things. Like I grew up in a family that spoke Plotich so it's different for me but I can see how if I didn't know about those things, it would be very isolating.
I think it makes a difference, or maybe what Gabby is trying to get at is that there is an in-group language that we speak in our congregations, and that in-group language is not always tied to faith. Is sometimes tied to culture and history and family connections. And that happens in a lot of churches and in a lot of different settings, not just in church. But I think in our Mennonite churches, like particularly in Sargent, where it was founded for refugee slash immigrants from Russia, and that was like a very intentional thing that they did for this community, and this community stuck together, and so it like runs really strong and really deep, and it's actually somewhat recent as of 1949 or whatever, and so there's this very very strong in-group language, in-group culture that is hard to penetrate. Like even as someone that married kind of into that, like I find it that I had to try very hard to understand, and that is, and I want to differentiate that between, I want to make a differentiation between the in-group language and way that we go about talking to each other in life in general, and acknowledging and respecting and passing on the history of something. Because I was very compelled, like I said before, by the Anabaptist story. And I want to keep telling that story. I want the peacemakers, the martyrs, all of those examples to be something that people know about and respect, and I want that to even move people to live in a way that risks more in their life, in the way that they go about faith. But there's a difference between telling a story and saying we respect these stories and we think that they're important and they can shape us. And there's a difference between that and like having this very very particular language and exclusive way of like talking about who we are, right?
And on top of that too, I find until I tell somebody that I'm Mennonite or like prove it to them that I'm like the Epps from Langham, like they will speak like I'm somebody else, right? Like in Saskatchewan it's different because everybody knows me, but when I moved to Winnipeg, yeah, there's like people trying to educate me about like Mennonite culture, or like being like, oh, like actually that's a word that means this, and it's like, yeah, like I know a lot of Plotich, like like, so this concept that like if somebody doesn't look the way that you imagine it, you have to like trying to include them. Like, don't assume that somebody's not a part of that like in group because they don't look the part.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, before talking about the actual kind of racism questions, I'm just talking about, the diversity within our Mennonite churches. Now, is it even a, a good or important goal for us to work towards diversity? Because the other option is we have, the white Russian Mennonite church, and you have the Korean Mennonite church, and you have, all the different Mennonite churches from all their different cultures, and they just stick together, right? And why not do that? Like, do you think it is important for us to work for diversity within our own churches?
I was actually listening to a webinar put together by a former classmate of mine from Heston, and she's a Black educator on anti-oppression and anti-racism stuff. And her name is Bonita Chime, or she was also adopted. Actually, she's Black, was adopted into a Mennonite family, so her Mennonite last name is Gerber, and she had a panel of Black women, actually, a lot of them adoptees in the Mennonite world, and they kept saying, the goal is not to bring more Black people, more Hispanic people into our churches necessarily. Like, churches are always excited when there's more people coming in, right? And that's fair, that's good. But I don't think that the goal should be to attract like specific like colors of people. Instead, the goal should be to be better at who we are called to be, and let that attract others, and let that speak to others. Like, it spoke to me again, the Anabaptist story. I was very compelled by it, and that's why I chose this as my church. I chose Sargent as my church because when I went on their website, I was very attracted to the things that they were doing at that time, the organizations that they were supporting, the language that they used, and they actually laughed and said, "We haven't paid attention to our website in a while. Maybe we should." And this is often something that happens, right? We forget about our online presence, but it actually says a lot about who we are. And that's what attracted me to that specific congregation. And that's why I came. And if we continue to focus on the work and dismantling racism and looking at who we are, what our witness says to others, I think we would just in general be more appealing, not just to people of color, but to anybody that is looking for a church. So it's not necessarily that we should have as a goal to attract more Black people or brown people or Asians, right? I think that the goal is to be better at who we are called to be, and let that do the work. But if we don't do some of this work, if we are lazy at looking into our systems, our institutions, and the racism that runs deep in them, then we're never gonna get to the point where brown, Black, Asian, Indigenous people feel comfortable in our pews, right? So then it's kind of like neither but both, right? Like,
yeah, and I think that we need to consider this fine line between diversity and tokenism, because diversity implies that we've created a safer space for individuals to truly be who they are and to find confidence in our community. And we've made a space for them and said, we want you to feel comfortable here regardless of your age, race, gender, sexuality, all of those things. Not, we want our picture to look so nice on the website, so let's just, we're gonna learn about your culture and put on a day where we fish for African Mennonites, so we're gonna look up some food that we think African Mennonites eat, and we're gonna make it in our weird way that wasn't really taught to us, and then they'll come, and then we can take our picture and call it a day. Like, that's tokenism, and the other example would be diversity, right?
Many people in Canada, in North America, are seeing things that are going on in our context, and some of the movements, the protests, and just kind of this tipping point that's happening. But there's some confusion because we didn't think racism was a thing anymore. So, um, where is it? uh, Andrea, you mentioned like, okay, there's this deep-seated racism in our institutions. Uh, so many people don't know what that looks like, don't know the experience of people on the other end of racism. So can you kind of share that or share your thoughts on that big question? Does racism even exist, and what is this systemic racism? People feel like they're just being blamed for something they didn't do, and they, so help us to clear that up.
Sure. So, the definition that Andrea and I kind of worked on is that systemic racism is the misuse of power built on conceptions of supremacy. And like, that's long and wordy, but like, in the world today, systemic racism exists as white supremacy. It exists in institutions. So like the church, police, universities, the workplace, whatever, all the institutions that we have, like healthcare. And it exists interpersonally, so between two folks. So there's like different ways that racism manifests itself. Big ways would be systemically, little ways would be interpersonally. And the interpersonal stuff always contributes to the systemic stuff. So for example, a term called a microaggression means that it seems small in the moment, interpersonally, but it contributes to a higher system. An example of that would be like, what's a good one?
Like if I told Gabby, "Oh, you are pretty for a black girl,"
right? So that's a microaggression. Like, you can't really put your finger on how mean that really is because it's well intentioned. And specifically in the church, I would say that it looks like those types of microaggressions or disbelief that people of color could hold authoritative positions in the church, or questioning like, but like, where are you really from? Like if somebody asks me where I'm from, I say Langham, Saskatchewan. And then they always go, yeah, but like, where are you really from? Which actually just translates to, why aren't you white? So that's actually hurtful. That's a microaggression. It is like a small phrase that has the capacity to hurt me deeply, but systemically, everybody who's like me, it hurts. So I would say that that's kind of how racism manifests. Like it's the norm, right? Like having white supremacy as the norm in a culture is how that exists. Like I know that when I go to the beauty store, I can't find makeup that's the right shade for me. Or when I watch TV, a lot of the people acting on TV are white or don't look like me. When you pick up crayons at the store, the peach one always says skin tone. Like things like that, right? That contribute to this culture of racism.
I have a very different example in mind, particularly in my congregation again, which is like very German. Like, the culture is still very strong into this is how we do things, and I love my congregation, and I like, this is not me like hating on them, mm-hmm. right? But I think when you love something, there's also room for critique, right? Because you want it to be better, and you want to feel like you fit in, like you are loved. And so one example that I can think of that happened to me when I started at Sargent is that it was 5 minutes before the service started, and one of my coworkers was running around the church looking for me, and I was printing my sermon, and they come in and tell me, Andrea, the service is about to start. Like, it's 5 minutes. Like, where are you? Like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm printing my sermon. I still have 5 minutes. So the concept of time is one difference that I would say, like, culturally, like, brown and black cultures are kind of made fun of because they leave things to last minute, right? But our concept of time is inherently different. And so for me, I still had 5 minutes to prepare. And in their understanding, which I needed to fit in, right? Like, they're freaking out because they need me to fit in now that I work there into, you're prepared well before 5 minutes before the service. And the other way that can be read, an additional thing that I find, or I found hurtful, is the assumption that I wouldn't be prepared. That when the time came, I wouldn't be prepared because I wasn't prepared like the other person was or would have been, right? So again, this is not to hurt anyone, but in order for me to feel accepted and loved, I come with different assumptions. And if we wanted to be a multicultural, a diverse church, I think a lot of those assumptions would have to change. And I don't think that our churches are willing to let go of some of those things, right? A while ago, I wrote an article for the Mennonite. So not the Canadian Mennonite, but the Mennonite from the US, which is also changing their name because they're merging anyways. So in this article, I talked about complex identities. And my identity as a Mexican doesn't stop there, because I'm actually a pretty light skin Mexican if you compare me with other people from Mexico, right? And growing up, I was made fun of because I was too white. And this wasn't, I wouldn't say that this was necessarily bullying, but understanding that even though I was Mexican, I still benefited from being light skinned. So I never had trouble finding work in Mexico, and I, didn't need to struggle with some of the slurs. Like, yeah, getting made fun for being light skinned is not the same as, being called the N-word or like Indian or, whatever. So even though I identify as a person of color, I know how white supremacy through colorism benefited me, and how maybe I came ahead than some of my other classmates, and some of my peers. And also, I acknowledge that I am actually not first generation or second generation, or I'm pretty sure not even third generation to go to university. Like, I come from a family that has been, educated in university. My great grandpa actually went to university in Pittsburgh at one point, and so, like, I know that I've had privileges, and that has shaped me in ways that other people of color hadn't been given the opportunity, or even maybe other white people haven't been given the opportunity, right? And so the conversation of privilege is not just with white people, it's with everybody. It's like, how can you acknowledge and look at your life and say, these are things that I have not had to struggle with, and that doesn't give me the right to look down at people who have a struggle with them, right? It's a very complex, like I said, I wrote about it in the Mennonite, so maybe you can fish out that article. And it is like, when it comes to us, it gets pretty complicated. It's like, which ways have I benefited from the system? Which ways have I not benefited from the system? And sometimes I really struggle when like white people don't want to acknowledge that, because there's certainly a lot of ways that they benefited from the system. One story that I can think of is I was in a class with Carl Coop, and one of the readings was a research done of how Mennonites were actually like analyzed by the Nazis as they were fleeing Russia, and they tested according to Nazi standards to be like very, very Aryan, like almost the model people that the Nazis wanted. And so even acknowledging that, like, yes, these people were refugees, yes, their land was stolen and they were persecuted, and yet they benefited because of the color of their skin, right? In ways that, like, African immigrants didn't benefit, in ways that, you know, brown gypsies didn't benefit, right? And so it gets really complex, and I think as long as we come in with an open mind and love and care for the other, we can just keep having these conversations and learning together.
Yeah, I remembered what I was going to say, and actually she just said it, which is great. The term intersectionality, and that means that you have privileges in some ways and you have disprivileges in other ways, and it's important to analyze the ones you can control, like your job and like your marriage status and all of those things, but also your things you can't control, your race, your sexuality, your gender, all those things, and actually think critically about them and apply them to your life and recognize in which ways the system does benefit you and which ways it doesn't.
Like this whole the systemic racism piece for a lot of people just seems too big to tackle, right? Like it's, or institutional questions, like where do you even start, or the historical, that feeling that, well, I wasn't there during, colonialism here in Canada, or it was my great grandparents who had slaves. It wasn't me. Okay, whose problem is systemic racism?
Okay, so this is a very good question. We get asked this question right off the bat every single time that we have any of these conversations. And I want to acknowledge that it is not your fault that your ancestors like had slaves or live on indigenous land or you're not responsible for the actions of your ancestors. But unfortunately, your ancestors created a system of power. And because of your skin tone and place in our specific context in Canada, you benefit from what is called white privilege. And white privilege is having, like, you could still have a very difficult life, but the one factor that's not contributing to the difficulty of your life is the tone of your skin. And so I'm not saying that white people don't have hard lives, live in poverty, etc. But I am saying that white people don't experience the like I experience many traumas as well as also having brown skin. So because of that, I'm viewed as an other in our society, whereas a white person is not. And many things act to benefit white people in those situations, such as connections, like network connections. Like all of your family went to university, so now you have all these connections, and maybe now you can get into that university. I'm the first person in my family to go to university. I don't have those types of connections, and that is actually rooted in the color of my skin and where I'm from. And other examples would be like going to the store and just being able to buy your foundation, no problem, it's there, like all of those sorts of things. Seeing yourself on TV or as doctors and lawyers highly overrepresented in those fields, and you feel like, oh, okay, well that person looks and has the same kind of life as me, so obviously I can do that. Whereas for us, it's a bit of a glass ceiling. It's like we don't really see people like us thriving. So it's difficult to view yourself as somebody who can thrive. So those are some examples. There are a multitude. So as you can see, by benefiting from that type of power, it actually is your responsibility to educate other white people and say, look, man, like we're actually benefiting in these ways, and it's our job to somehow also allow equity for these other races of people so that they too can be successful and thrive and share some of our power.
One of the examples that I can think of is when I introduce myself to someone, actually oftentimes to someone that goes to a different Mennonite church. So I'll introduce myself and I'll say, I work at Sargent Avenue Mennonite. And that's my way of making a connection with them. And they'll automatically assume that I work as some ambiguous like cleaning or like the office, or that their first assumption is not that I am a pastor at this particular Mennonite church. And I would say that if it and you might think, okay, why do you introduce yourself instead of saying I work at Sargent Avenue Mennonite Church? Why wouldn't you introduce yourself as I'm a pastor at, right? And oftentimes I do it very, very intentionally because I want to know what they're going to say in response. Because if it were a white man saying, I work at Sargent Avenue Mennonite Church, would your first assumption be that they're the secretary or the janitor? And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with those positions at all. But the assumptions that we made from the get-go are different for one, women, and two, women of color. And the way that I explain being a woman of color is, how we talk about the value of the parts added is bigger than the value of the parts by themselves, right? And I would say it is the same with the difficulties of the value of being a woman and a person of color. You add that, and it is automatically more difficult than just being a woman or being a person of color, right? And so even within the church, you see these assumptions, and if you were to let them get to you, you wouldn't get to be a pastor. You wouldn't get to have a college degree. You wouldn't, right? And I'm not saying that people that don't get there, that there's something wrong with them. No, but it's actually very, very hard to swim against the current, right? If constantly the assumption is you're not that person, or you can't be that person, or you're not assumed to be that person, that educated professional, right? Then at some point it does start to wear on you, and Gabby,
you believe it,
yeah,
right?
And Gabby talked about microaggressions earlier, and microaggressions, oftentimes people kind of brush them off as, well, but it wasn't intentional, but it wasn't meant that way, right? Like people had good intentions, it just came out wrong. And I'd say, and that's fair. I understand that people are not necessarily out to get us, right? But after the 10th microaggression that day, you would understand that I'm pretty exhausted. And I don't actually feel like interacting with people because I'm just bracing myself for the next thing, right?
Totally.
So yeah, like racism is more than just institutional racism, and one-on-one racism is not necessarily better or worse, right?
Yeah, and so it is the job of the people who are perpetuating the racism to educate each other and like in an attempt for equity, because it's different. If I'm like, oh, hey, white person, could you just like quit being racist? That would be awesome. Here's some educational resources. Learn that. Come back to me. They're going to be like, what? I don't care. But if a white person to another white person, especially if a black indigenous person of color isn't around, is like, hey, quit that, cut that out, that's garbage, let's not do that anymore, here's some resources, they're gonna take it more seriously, right? So it actually, and like, it's very exhausting to do that all the time as a person of color, because not only do I have to take the flack for being a person of color, I have to turn the other cheek and educate. And that is exhausting. Whereas if white people could just do some of that educating within their own group, because of white privilege and white supremacy, that's kind of their responsibility, then like we would have a lot of an easier time. Specifically, the question that I've been asked a lot, that I think a lot of people are looking for an answer to, is what about reverse racism? And I just want to touch on this briefly. And I'm going to say a very jarring statement, but I am going to back it up. Reverse racism does not exist. And I'm going to tell you why. There's such a thing as racial prejudice and racial discrimination, and there's such a thing as racism. I can be very prejudiced or discriminatory to a white person. It can hurt the same as a white person being racist to me. In that moment, they can hurt equally bad. But the difference between racism and prejudice and discrimination is that that single interaction contributes to a larger system when it's racism. And when it's prejudice or discrimination, it's an isolated incident that does not contribute to a larger system. And it really sounds like a semantic argument again, but really it's important that we recognize that racism is systemic and prejudice and discrimination are isolated.
Okay, so now let's say, okay, there within our churches, people realize that racism, systemically, interpersonally, like all of that, like say they realize it's a thing, right? But we see a lot of people outside of the church, some who just don't believe it, some who don't care. What is it about people of faith? What is it about the gospel that might compel us to care? Why do people in the church care about this?
One short answer would be Christians shouldn't be focused on all lives matter when we're trying to say Black lives matter, Indigenous lives matter, because Jesus was very specific about naming the minorities that were suffering at that time the most, right? He said the poor, he named the poor, he named the sick, he named the widows, he named the orphans, right? He named the lepers that people would push out of the city. He made an example of the Samaritan man in his parable and the Samaritan woman in his interaction. And these are minorities, and the way that Jesus used those characters to be the heroes, the people that listen, was very intentional. It was to change the general Jewish view on these minorities, on this person that they would have assumed as the other, right? So when we say all lives matter, is actually very, very dismissive. And it's like, well, then people shouldn't have worried about, or then Jesus shouldn't have worried about the poor. He shouldn't have worried about the lepers. He shouldn't have worried about the Samaritans. He should have just worried about everybody, right? Like, why don't we just keep it general? And my answer would be because Jesus didn't keep it general. He was very specific as to what marginalized groups he wanted people to pay attention and to help.
Mm-hmm. And some of his other stories too, like think of the story of the lost sheep, right? He's got 100 sheep. Like, why is he so worried about that one that goes missing? And that is very analogous to what's going on today. There are certain groups that are being targeted more and having more hardship done to them. And I 100% guarantee to you that Jesus wouldn't say, oh yeah, we got like 80 other cultures, like we'll just, don't need those ones, right? Like he would be there. He would look for those people that are suffering specifically and say like, hey, I know the rest of you 99 have like got each other. I'm going to go and like help the group that needs it right now.
And a lot of Jesus' critiques were not just to people in power, but to people that lived comfortably, right? And I think in today's society, even as a person of color, I acknowledge that I have a lot of privilege and I have a lot of advantages that people like me back home in Mexico or people of color even here in Canada don't have. Mm-hmm. I am college educated. I have a master's. I have, even though I'm not full-time, I don't make a terrible amount of money. I've been able to acquire property and have savings, right? So I live very comfortably. And I think Jesus often critiqued those who lived very comfortably and held some amount of power and benefited from the status quo. Mm-hmm. So it is on us. It is the message is to people like us, right? And the way that we respond and the way that we live is a direct answer to Jesus's challenge. And so if we choose to ignore the movement Black Lives Matter, we choose to ignore Jesus' call to align with the suffering minority.
Yep.
Now, so take it to the next step then, right? That people are now thinking, okay, there is something in our culture, something that is wrong in the way we see each other. And Jesus compels us to be specific and to do something about it. Now, what can people do? And before we get to what you're doing specifically at Sargent, just in general, how does someone even begin to step into that conversation?
I mentioned earlier my friend Bonita, who is a Black educator, and she talks about anti-racism, anti-oppression work as a journey where we are willing to fail forward. So staying where we're at is not going to help. You not engaging in this is not going to help. You staying silent is only going to allow these systems, these issues to continue, right? And so how do we do it? We fail forward. We are committed to engaging even if we don't have all the answers. And I think this affects primarily some of our churches because as majority white with very strong German heritage, we like to do things right from the beginning. We like to have a plan. We like to have the answers. And it's like, it's not going to be, it's not something that you can check off the list. I remember meeting with a leader in our Mennonite world, and they wanted, exactly that, a checklist. And okay, so if we do the training, if we set up one person in each committee that looks different, if we and I'm thinking, having that checklist is helpful, but you never just get to check it off permanently, right? This is ongoing. There's always something that is going to be happening, and you're willing and you're needing to be willing to fail forward. And how do we start? Like, start reading, people of color's experience, books, theology. I mean, everything in any subject has had an author, either a Black author or an Indigenous author or a Latino author. And so if you're willing to diversify the things you read, the stories you tell, the documentaries, I think that's a place to start so that you can start failing forward.
Yeah. I think too, a good way to do this, I feel like it's a 3-step model. This is like my vision of it. Step number 1, get yourself to a baseline education. So there are lots of different resources out there, like White Fragility, the book is really good. There's so much stuff on race theory out there. that's actually easily digestible. Like, if you don't want to read a whole book, I promise you there are TikToks out there that can get the message to you, like, right? YouTube videos, anything, TED Talks, all those sorts of things. Get to yourself to that baseline education. Step 1. Step 2, practice. So you find your next white friend and they're now your victim and you're like, okay, man, we are going to have this conversation. We're going to dismantle this together. And like, once you've had some practice and you're like, okay, I feel comfortable in that, you know, then you can actually educate others. You know, hold a night, hold an event where you and 6 of your closest friends sit down and you make a PowerPoint and you're like, okay, I learned all this stuff. And I think it's important that you learn it too, because the only way for us to actually have any forward progressive motion here is to all of us get to a baseline understanding of these issues. That's the problem, is that we're not actually educated, right? And I think like a really important quote that comes to mind every time I think about these sharings and things is this quote by Brene Brown. And she says, in order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it, and not how you imagine their experience to be. And that's the whole point of reading from authors who are BIPOC, from listening to people who are BIPOC. You actually need to hear that story from somebody who is part of that marginalized group before you are able to understand or share that story. And you need to believe them.
And I think if I could say something, your question was where do we start, right? And I think somewhere where we can start is by not saying things like, well, but that's not how they meant it, or but it shouldn't make you feel that way. Or why don't you see the positive side, right? Like always looking for that silver lining. And particularly with Gabby and I, we've talked about this because this happens to us. We'll give the example of let's say the time when I was being chased because it was 5 minutes till the service and I wasn't ready, right? And I'll give that story and people will say, oh, but I would have done the same thing. So it's not racist because I'm not racist, right? Or they didn't mean it that way. Or why do you choose to see it that way? And my response is, hey, I'm here. I didn't leave because of it. I'm not assuming that you or them are the worst people in the world, right? I do see some of the silver linings that come with being a person of color and experiencing some of these things. You don't need to convince me of your, good intentions. But what I'm telling you is that it hurts. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate it if you stop doing it. You don't need to minimize my pain in order for you to feel like you're not a bad person, right? Mm-hmm. You need to listen and say, okay, because I love you, I'll try to pay more attention to that. I hope that I don't do that again, right? It's not a guilt thing. I think a lot of people get stuck in the guilt thing because they can easily see themselves doing that same thing or making that same comment. But it's not about guilt. Like we're not trying to guilt people into putting us in positions of power or anything like that. It's like, I want to be here. I do, and I am still here after time and time again that you've heard us. What we're saying is, if you love us, if you want us around, you'll change some of these things because you're actually hurting us, right? Mm-hmm.
There's a term for that. It's called racial gaslighting, and so what it is it's often unintentional that a white person will do this, but if I say, hey, like, that really hurt me and I'm not okay with that, in order to slough off some of that guilt, they'll be like, oh, like, just look for the silver lining, or, oh, yeah, they didn't mean it that way. And actually, that's invalidating. You're invalidating my feelings. You're gaslighting me. You're trying to convince me of a different reality that I'm not seeing. And that's not cool. That's not a healthy emotional way to handle somebody else's feelings. I would just say also, like, something to be aware of as white people is being so scared of political correctness. And like, oh, they're managing everything we're saying these days, and like, oh, it's all semantics. Like, that is true to you. That's how it feels. But to me, being referred to by the N-word or other harmful words, I know Indigenous people being referred to as slurs is harmful. And like, just taking the 2 seconds to think of a different word and use it properly is so much more meaningful than you could ever imagine. That shows that you care so deeply that you will choose your words wisely, and you will make a conscious effort to be better in just even the smallest action of a word. And that is so deeply meaningful to me and to many people of color. And I think it's important to not be like so terrified of political correctness, and understand that it exists for a reason and it isn't just semantic. And I think that's very crucial, and that's something that isn't talked about as often. It's not a bad thing. Embrace it.
You're encouraging us in different ways that we can get going in the conversation. But you have been already doing very specific things in your church. So share a little bit about what you have done, and what have you learned from that experience? What has some of the what are some of the things you've been impressed by or challenged by in terms of both the conversation nights and also the support group?
Well, the support group is still not up and running. I have just recruited a couple more people last night and hoping to get that started next week. But just even connecting with people and saying like, okay, this is something that we're doing. Like, are you interested? Oh my goodness. Everybody I've asked, like, huge paragraphs, like, this is something that I never thought would happen in the church. This is so meaningful to me. I'm getting emotional. This is so meaningful to me. I definitely want to be on board. Like, there's an overwhelming response to this, because even myself, I, up until March, didn't realize that I could speak about these issues in the context of my church. And so I'm learning that for other minority Mennonites, having a group, a solid group saying, I hear you, I know what you've been through, I don't know your exact story, I don't know your exact pain, but I can relate, and we can do this together and grow together in a safer space than if we just decided to like talk about it in a sermon, right? Like, it's more intimate, it's more it's like easier to relate to those in the group. So I feel that is something I've learned, that there's power in sharing your traumas. It doesn't necessarily, it doesn't have to be a Debbie Downer group where you're like, oh, my life is so bad and nobody cares about me and the Mennonite Church hates me. It's just nice to be able to be vocal about these things without having to necessarily deal with conceptions of white fragility. Because I know, like, my Oma is Russian Mennonite, sweetest woman ever, 10 out of 10, would recommend. But if I speak to her about sometimes that the church has hurt me, it can feel very personal, a very personal attack. Like, oh, like, we didn't mean it like that, like, you know, things like that, like, and just trying to convince me to, like, stay. And it's like, no, I'm gonna stay. Like, I love the church. But sometimes you need an outlet for these kinds of conversations with people who understand. And it's not going to be like a Mennonite hate group. We're not going to like come with our pitchforks and be like, stop that. You know, it's very empowering to be able to speak about issues that you didn't realize you were able to speak about before.
Actually, with another pastor that I know, and often when we see each other, we'll just get started talking about some of the frustrations of being like a minority on staff or a minority in our own church. And like most of the time we're laughing. Like it's so silly. Some of these things are so silly, right? And you're letting it out and the other person is laughing like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that that's happened to you too, right? So yeah, it's more of like to support each other rather than like to get together and like plot like, something. But I'd say so one thing that we've done is these conversations with the congregation, and we started with setting a common language. So Gabby and I collected a bunch of terms and some specific examples from our lives. And so we did this very intentionally. We started with these terms and these stories to assert a common language with the people that we were going to be having these conversations with. And I've often heard the critique of, well, why didn't you start with the Bible, right? And it's like, give us a minute. Like, we'll get there. But I think it's very important to first say, this is what these things mean, right? Before we actually get into digging what the issues are, this is how we're going to talk about it. So setting some ground rules and some common language. The second, we actually had Steve Heinrichs come and talk to us of how we listen. And Steve actually went into a lot of detail about liberation theology and minority authors and his experiences talking with Indigenous leaders and how he could listen and how white people, particularly Christians, could listen. Our third session was on...
So I spoke about defunding and abolishing the police and what that means for Anabaptists and what that means globally and specifically in our context in Winnipeg. And it went over really well. And I feel like it went over really well because we had already come to this baseline understanding of terminology and hurt that is going on. And then Steve came and taught us how to listen to BIPOC. So when I was speaking about it, people weren't immediately at that wall of defense armor, like, ooh, they're gonna say something bad. It was from a very vulnerable place that I shared, and from a very vulnerable place that people listened. And when that vulnerability is met with vulnerability, it's a lot easier to convey the spirit of the message that you're trying to get across. Yeah.
Our fourth session, we actually invited a Congolese Canadian and an Indigenous person to come and share some of their stories. And these are people that have been really, really active in the church and in their faith. And so starting from the place of, like, I am a Christian and like I'm Mennonite or whatever, but I also carry all this history from my people where white supremacy has, displaced and hurt and abused our people, our families, right? And so I think we specifically put the stories last because we wanted us to kind of get some sessions where we were more attuned to, like, what do we have to learn in order to hold these stories the way that they should be held, with the respect and with love and with care. And then our final session, we had to postpone a session, but our final session is coming up on Wednesday, and we will talk about where we go from now as a church. What do we do with this information? What are the ways that our even institution as a congregation perpetuates some racism, or maybe what are some of the teachings, like I was talking about Jesus and like his focus on the marginalized and the poor and the hurt, right? And so what are some of these things that as a church empower us to look deeply inside and say, what can we do better? So I would say that it is, you have to embrace some of this language that is from outside of the church, because the church has we're not going to come up with a language in from one day to another. And this is something that we've often not talked about within the walls of the church. So we do need to embrace some of that language that is outside, but understanding that we still have a lot of tools in our faith and from the Bible, from Jesus' example, to guide us in this work.
And I would also add that something specifically that Andrea and I have talked about learning with respect to our conversation nights and race in general, is that a lot of the time, like, we walk around with this huge armor on. Like, okay, I know today I'm going to get at least 3 comments and probably some questions, and I know it's going to hurt, so I'm just going to put on the big armor and brace myself for this. And when it happens, I'm just going to feel numb. I'm going to push it down as far as I possibly can, throw it in the garbage as soon as I get home, and call it a day, right? But with this education that we're sharing with people, and when we're being vulnerable like this, you got to put the armor away, right? You can't be defensive. You can't be on the offense. You have to be receptive to the types of questions and comments that you know are going to hurt you. And in my head, going into this, I was like, perfect. I've had my whole life to practice. This is going to be no problem at all. And like, as soon as it started, I was like, whoa, like this is affecting me way more than I thought it was going to. Like, even just seeing like a Facebook post of a Black man in Chicago being hurt, it just takes this huge emotional toll on me. I'm like, oh, that's like, that could be my brother, right? Like, those are people that I am connected to. And you're not really used to that when you have that armor on. You're like, well, that sucks. Like, another Black person harmed, right? But when you do this emotional heart work, suddenly you realize that, like, things are going to affect you a lot more than you thought they were going to. And that's actually a beautiful thing, because I personally believe that the only time that any progress is going to be made in understanding somebody else's perspective is through empathy and vulnerability. And if you're not able to be that way with someone, they're never going to understand your perspective. So that's something that we've learned that's been hard but good.
Yeah, so with all the things that you have already been journeying through in terms of your work that you're doing at Sargent, and I mean your own lives and your work in the Mennonite Church, what are some of the things that you are taking away that you have learned that you think would be helpful for us to know?
For me, there's a lot of all lives matter, I don't see color, comments like those. And I just really urge people to think about what they're saying in those contexts. There's a quote here that I have that I want to share that I think is super important. And instead of saying, I see no color, or I don't see color, or those types of things, we need to say, I see your color, and I honor your input. I believe your lived experiences. I will educate myself. I will fight against the racism that harms you. I will listen to you. I will make this commitment to you. Because when we gloss over things like that, it's incredibly invalidating, and it's not meant to be. Or, when people say things like, oh, our church is such a united nations. Like, that's harmful. We are striving to be united, but when you say things that push us out and say like, oh yeah, you're not the same as us, that is so deeply harmful. And we need to think about the things that we say so that we're not pushing people out, so that we're actually embracing people in. And I think it's important to make the distinction between calling someone out and calling someone in. And that's especially true for us on the defense here, is like, a lot of the time when I was younger, I would just say like, you are being racist. How could you say something like that? Like, blah, 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 right? Just very aggressive about it. And then I realized that that is more in tune of calling someone out for something, which is embarrassing and hurtful and sometimes necessary. But what's most effective is being like, calling somebody into a conversation saying like, hey, like, why do you think that? Let's chat about that. Let's talk about that. And let's really get to like what you're really saying here, because I don't think it lines up with what you believe.
For me, I actually recently started going back to counseling. There was a period where I tried several counselors here in Winnipeg and I didn't really connect with any of them. And one of my friends was like, why don't you look for a counselor of color? Because a lot of times that's like, important to be able to connect and instead of like having to explain exactly how something felt, like maybe they already know, because they've experienced it themselves. And I wasn't able to find, like, you wouldn't believe how incredibly hard it is to find a counselor of color. So I ended up going to a counselor who's a woman and was very well recommended to me. And the importance of processing some of these things, like we talked about the armor, and like that's one way of staying alive, but it's actually like not facing some of the hurt, some of the pain that you're carrying. And so in this work, it's incredibly important to have like some self-care, some ways to treat yourself, to check in with how you're feeling. It is very, very exhausting, much more than I anticipated, actually. And I will be very honest, I've shared in some other circles that earlier this year I was in a church meeting, and that there had been several things that kind of made it difficult, whether they were microaggressions or pretty like intense interactions. And I went to my room and I tried to process with someone who I thought was like safe or that would understand, and it turned out horrible, because they honestly had like no baseline to help me process some of what had happened, and instead ended up saying very, very hurtful things to me. Again, not really knowing, totally trying to help, but it ended up being so bad. It got so bad that I was having panic attack, and I ended up feeling like I couldn't be in the room, because I was sharing a room with that person. And so I ended up leaving the room and desperately trying to call people that I thought might be able to help me calm down and like process some of this stuff. So I think I've learned the hard way that self-care is incredibly important, and counseling is incredibly important. And like I said, even when you try, like, you might not find a counselor that, of color, with whom you don't need to explain everything and why it affects you so much when people say these things. But even just having someone, I think for me now, I'm seeing as very helpful. But it is tough. Like you can, it's especially when you are intentional about being vulnerable, is when things hurt you the most.
Yeah.
And you want to be true, and you want to be vulnerable, and you want to be in community with others and learn alongside others. And but it is taxing, and I don't think that that's something that people quite recognize. When we're putting ourselves out there, we're actually risking a lot of ourselves to be hurt. And I kind of knew that, but didn't really understand until it was so hard.
Yeah.
If think about Wednesday when you have your next event with the church, and you're trying to think about how you're going forward, and you want to provide some hope, right? Like hope for the church going forward. If you had a short message of hope for our church, whether that be Sargent or MCM or the church at large, what would you say, or where do you see hope, or what? How can we how can we embrace that?
For me, it's so obvious because the issues that we're talking about, like aside from race, but being immigrants, being poor, having to relocate on nothing, struggling immensely, watching our brothers and sisters be killed by politicians and, the authorities. Like, this is a familiar story to Mennonites. And so, for me, there's a lot of hope there because the empathy is already built. They already know what it feels like to really, truly struggle and not have any kind of control over that situation. And this has actually been the story of Anabaptists since the conception of Anabaptists. So for me, there's actually a lot of hope because empathy is kind of the only tool you can use to go forward. And the other tool is education. Oh, well, lucky for us, Mennonites love education. So for me, it's just empowering, like seeing all of these like older Mennonites coming to these groups. Like, are you kidding me? This is beautiful. Like, seeing people that have no concept of the struggles that we go through, sitting there, listening, crying, writing things down, telling us about their past struggles, relating to us, confiding in us that they don't have all the answers, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and just being grateful that we can all even just do this and that we are failing forward together is such a beautiful symbol of hope for me.
For me, it is energizing. Like, a lot of people approach these conversations with dread and guilt, right? And I'd say no, like, let this be energizing because it is something that we are called to do. Like I said before, I believe Jesus, by naming these minorities, calls us to do this work. Whether back then they had the term racism or not, right? Like, it is energizing. Like, we are engaging in something that our faith calls us to engage in and dismantle. Like, Jesus wanted these systems of power and oppression to be dismantled. So this is just a different way to get at it, right? This is a different angle. And I'll share that one of my coworkers actually came to me and COVID had been really hard for extroverts like me, because it took all the fun away from my job. Like, recording sermons online is not my thing. I love doing sermons. I have no problem with that. But like, I want to be with people, right? And like, a lot of why I'm involved in the church is because of coming together and singing together and learning together. And so with COVID, it had been tough. And then all of a sudden I had this project to work with Gabby on, and people were showing up and learning. And one of my coworkers said, you look like something gave you light. Your energy, your attention, you were just more engaged. You could see the change. And I was like, of course, because this is something that I care about. And I am deeply, deeply moved that our congregation and other congregations like yours are engaging and trying to tackle some of these conversations. So it is exciting and it is energizing, and it is just a different angle to get at to what we're called to do as a faith community.
Like, I think it's Article 22 in the Confession of Faith that says, it talks about like non-resistance and helping the oppressed. Like, that's in the Mennonite Confession of Faith. So like, I don't know, it's cool that we're actually getting a real life opportunity like right now to make a huge difference, and it's in line with our Confession of Faith. Like, that's pretty cool,
Gabby and Andrea, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us about your experiences and how you've learned and how you are challenging us as a church to move forward together. I think it is beautiful and exciting work. And wouldn't it be amazing if the Mennonite Church was on the forefront?
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, but all the best to you as you continue on. And Thank you for joining us and sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Moses. This is like a very special and sacred opportunity, I think, for us, not just as people of color or Mennonites of color, but as just people, to be able to have these deep and meaningful conversations and use that effectively and confidently through the life and teaching of Jesus. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate the opportunity and want to send greetings to the people at Sterling, and just really commend you on your effort to learn more about this. And one thing that I'll say is it's really reassuring when a church is willing to spend time on having these conversations and hearing about this topic, because we often hear a lot about Mennonite food and how much Mennonites like singing, and it's well, can we talk about how much Mennonites hate racism? That's really encouraging to me, much more than talking about other stuff. So yeah, it's just really exciting to have the opportunity to connect in this way.